Ben Tindall has been a guy who wants to lead something that is accomplishing something. Early on in his career, that meant helping families find temporary shelter. These days, he's still working on behalf of families, but it is farm families. In particular, he wants to make sure farm families in the state of Washington can remain in farming, not get overburdened with regulations, and have a reasonable chance of turning a profit. Hi, I'm Dave Price. Ben is the executive director of Save Family Farming. He works as a communication bridge between farmers and the people who are not in agriculture, and to make sure that everybody understands how this squeeze on profits, the changing markets, water regulations, and new rules about overtime can impact the family farmer. Well, Ben, hello. Thanks for joining us. How are you?
I am good. I am good. Hey, thanks for letting us have a chance to chat. I've been looking forward to this.
Of course. Where are you right now? What city?
Well, so I am in Olympia, Washington. So
Olympia.
I
Okay.
am calling. We actually are having one of our bright sunny. This is one of the first days that it's actually warm, and was out on the eastern side of the state yesterday and actually got a little bit of a sunburn. So it was like, okay, summer has finally shown up. It was came kicking and screaming, but finally showed up here in Washington.
Awesome. Hey, let's talk about your background a little bit.
Sure.
So you work for an organization called Save Family Farming, and you did not grow up on a farm. So I'm always curious about people's journey to get, hey, how'd you get to where you are? So I'm sure as a little boy, you dreamed of representing an organization devoted to family farmers, right?
Because they're paying my salary, yes, that is the right
Good
answer.
answer. Good answer.
But no, that this was not something that was necessarily in the 20-year plan when I was in college. I went to school for communications, and was the dream was to do something in the arts or theater. And my parents wisely said, hey, you might want a backup plan. Don't want to kill your dreams, but if you don't become a movie star, you might want to have a backup plan. So I chose politics, and so that plan B became a plan only, and really went into the political realm, got a degree in politics, worked for a number of both federal legislators down in Texas, and then eventually moved up to Washington State and worked in the state house for several years for a legislator down in the Columbia Gorge area, beautiful part of the state, beautiful part of the country. But really so my background is politics, policy, nonprofit leadership, working in those kind of realms. Did a lot of work on some housing and homelessness in the Central Texas area and led some operations there. So anyway, kind of taking an issue or a cause and jumping on, really advocating, and really trying to figure how do we pair an important cause that we really will need some solutions in. And years ago, housing was that cause, and then tying that into policy and politics. And then about, I guess, 2019 or so, took on a role with the Washington State Farm Bureau, worked in their governmental affairs area for a couple years. And really, that was kind of my entrance into working in agriculture and really seeing, one, the value and need of agriculture. And we all know that, headwise, we all know
Sure.
food is important, we all rely on it. But seeing how viable, or how vulnerable, that's the word, how vulnerable agriculture, at least in Washington State, really is to the policies and the decisions that, for better or worse, non-farming, primarily urban or suburban lawmakers are making these decisions that are deeply impacting the future of agriculture in other parts of the state, and how those decisions really are making some lasting effects that are, unfortunately, in many respects, crippling agriculture and hurting this community. And so then I want to say a couple of years ago, 2024, took on this role as executive director with Save Family Farming. And that was a good opportunity to kind of meld and blend that communications background with that policy and legislative background, as well as saying, okay, I really now have this heart and passion to advocate for the future of agriculture, in particular in Washington State. And we can talk about, how that's grown over the past couple of years, but it really has expanded beyond just Washington State, and kind of as we're able to address and deal with certain issues that really have some even national impacts. So it's been a real fun journey and to see, but it's fun to see how the pieces all fall into place, and it's been a really good ride so far.
Well, let's start within your border. What's going on in Washington right now? You have some primary crops, depending on where you're talking about in the state, but you all are involved in a number of issues. As we look nationally, obviously, there's a lot of maybe legacy media attention on family farmers and how they're doing right now. And you really have to start digging into the different industries, perhaps, which tell different stories about how everybody is doing. But let's talk specifically about what's going on in Washington. So, how do you view things right now?
Right now, Washington agriculture is that it is difficult in many ways to be optimistic in our state. Unfortunately, the we just received over the past, I guess, month or so, the USDA put out a report from 2024 that showed the return to producers in Washington State is we are 50th in the nation, that we are the lowest. We producers in our state receive the lowest return, really one out of obviously all the states, but we are one of two that we lost about, an average of nearly $400 million. This The agricultural industry in Washington State lost. We were in the negative. Only one other state, Alaska, lost about 10 million, and everyone else was in the black. And so agriculture, one of the other statistics is that we see about two farms a week on average. We are losing over the past. I don't know what we've lost 3,000 plus farms in the past 5 years. You do the math, but there are some serious issues that agriculture is facing, and those are primarily due to things like overregulation of certain natural resources, limitations. I would argue overreach, overregulation of certain water resources, and also a big one has been labor and the large labor costs. Farms, we want to and need to provide for our labor force, but that is something that the state has just increased those costs exponentially over the past really about 3 or so years, and it is running farms out of business. And so the current temperature of agriculture in Washington State is looking poor, but that's where organizations such as ours, we're really trying to sound off that alarm, highlight these challenges. Safe family farming we really see our focus as kind of helping bridge that gap between the farming community and the non-farming. We really have this target audience of that non-farming urban suburban voter. How do we connect agriculture's message, our challenges, the issues that agriculture is facing? How do we make those come alive to that non-farming urban suburban voter that is sending and electing individuals to the state offices, state house, state senate, and those are the ones that are making the decisions that are impacting agriculture? How do we kind of bridge that gap? And that really has been the challenge for us. We are a communications and advocacy organization at our heart, and how do we help communicate in ways that a non-farmer really will understand and resonate, and they'll see we need to see some serious drastic change in agriculture in Washington if we want to see a viable, sustainable future for agriculture moving forward. So that's kind of our work.
All right, so you left a Republican red state in Texas. You're in a Democratic blue state in Washington, which has to be a help for you to have both of those experiences. So maybe let's talk about labor. The bigger argument by those who wanted to push up wages here and then concerned about essentially unpaid overtime, if you will. You're helping people potentially make more money. Maybe it's closer to working to 40 hours or whatever it is. But then on the converse side of that, you see the strain on business. So how do you loop those two together to make that work both ways?
Couple of things. One, I'd love to say there is a solution, and give me 5 minutes, I'll outline it, and we'll solve the problem. I know
Sure.
that's not how this works. I guess, because been in this field for so long, there's a lot of sides. But at the same time, it has been encouraging to see that both Republican and Democratic voices are recognizing we've got to figure out and come together. One side doesn't necessarily have the answer. We've got to work together. We've got to have conversation and dialogue, because both sides have elements that are correct. One, that from a more, say left leaning, that has the priority of the worker, and we need to protect and provide for farm workers and the labor and make sure that them and their families are respected, that they are provided the benefits that they deserve, the wages that they deserve. That needs to be a priority. But then on the other side, the Republicans that tend to kind of prioritize business, and what's best for business ultimately trickles down in theory to the employees. And if we're taking care of that business and providing and protecting the business, the employees ideally would be provided and protected as well. So finding, how do we marry both of those? And so safe family farming, one of the things we're really working on is how do we highlight and share and be a catalyst to bring those sides together. With this past year, we just produced our second documentary film called Farming on the Brink, that highlights one, a story of a farmer in central Washington area that was facing, their farm going to last another year. It's a large farm. They employ a vast amount of work and workers, but we really wanted to hear one from the employer side. But through this film, we interviewed a number of farm workers and kind of allowing farm workers to have the platform and the microphone to share their perspective. And it's been fascinating to hear their side of the story. We had a rally actually at the Capitol a couple of years ago with literally hundreds of farm workers coming out, flooding the steps of the state capitol, marching around the grounds of the Capitol, saying, in essence, this overtime bill is hurting us. That lawmakers, in theory, think that they're helping or providing or protecting farm workers, and ultimately the on the ground result is it's limiting their hours, it's hurting them. Again, it's that trying to connect the dots with a non-farming, more urban business office oriented individual who says, well, I work my 40 hours, I put in, 9 to 5,
Hmm.
5 days a week. That's not the reality with agriculture. It's very seasonal. These seasonal components, hours look a whole lot different than, necessarily just a 365, 52 weeks out of the year, we're working 40 hours a week. That's not the reality with agriculture. You work when the work is there. And so trying to help non-farming leaders understand that really is a challenge. But you're absolutely right that having that kind of both sides perspective, that we can see value. I guess the solution, if I can, I don't know that I have the silver bullet to cure the issue, but it really is collaboration. We've got another group here in Washington that I greatly appreciate and have nothing but respect for. They advocate more for kind of the smaller, more urban farms. Arguably can tend to be more of a potentially a left-leaning organization. The leader was, sharing, she's seeing, we've got to do something with labor. She came out against the kind of current legislation in Washington that and she took some heat for it, but seeing how can we partner with other perspectives and other groups that might have a little different bent, politically, but saying there's common ground that we've got to work together for both the farmer, the employer, as well as the farmer, as in farm worker, doing the work. I think there are solutions, but we got to have a conversation.
And how is this immigration focus in the new administration federally? How has that impacted the flow of temporary workers who come through, these seasonal workers? How has it affected those who were already part of the workforce there?
Yeah. One of the unfortunate things really is that it has done little but create a whole lot of fear and a whole lot of uncertainty with really over the past, I guess about year and a half or so. Like I said, we in 2024, just to kind of give a quick example, in 2024 we had a, like I said, a large rally at the U.S. Capitol. I'm sorry, the Washington State Capitol. I apologize. At the state capitol, and we literally had, like I said, 300 plus individuals come out, and it was an incredible opportunity to get their voice out, to hear that farm worker voice. We tried to recreate that the following year in 2025. I think we had about 30 people
Mm.
come out. There were only a couple farm workers who were willing to come out. The message we heard over and over and over was, we're scared. We're not willing to come out. We're not willing to come to the Capitol. We don't want to necessarily poke our head out and raise, draw attention to us, because they're scared. And then we've heard from a number of farm employers who have experienced fear in their own fields, that we have workers who are scared to come to work, because there's just uncertainty. And so that really has, again, then this reinforces the need for good communication. I think that has been a something that, for lack of a better way of putting it, I think the administration has kind of fallen down on, of really communicating well. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're trying to accomplish, and the we are left with trying to put the pieces together and understand what exactly is happening, because this is putting farming in a very dangerous, vulnerable place, when not only do we have higher prices, costs, and regulations are running farms out of business, but now their labor force is on the brink of going away. People aren't wanting necessarily even come to Washington, the migrant workforce. There's individuals who are hesitant that come to Washington, and that's creating a large fear factor for farms, that they can't count on their workforce to show up, and it's causing, we actually, State Family Farming, we're putting together a live stream event conversation with a couple of farm worker or farmer, immigration attorney, and a farmer advocate group this upcoming week, to talk about, okay, what are the rights of the farmer, the farm owner? What are the steps that they should be doing to protect their farm, to protect their employees? Also, what are immigrant rights? What are farm worker rights? What rights do they have? Be it, I'm not necessarily even talking about documented or undocumented, although that plays into it, but we've seen so many individuals who do have the right paperwork in order. This is not we stand for, lawful, following the law, doing things the way you should do. We're not advocating for anyone to do something illegally, but we are advocating for proper process, due process, and that the rights of these individuals are protected and taken care of. And really, we're seeing a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, and that is causing a very vulnerable industry like agriculture in Washington to be even more vulnerable, just exponentially because of that.
You mentioned overregulation a few times. What's going on right there, and what's holding back the industry?
Right now, I just had a call with some of my colleagues about the Department of Ecology and some of the overregulation when it comes to the management of natural resources, in particular water.
Hmm.
There have been a number of bills, pieces of legislation over the past several years that are looking at buffers and riparian buffers around streams and waterways. In essence, looking to increase those buffers. We would argue that they're not relying on the best science and the data, that are looking more, on more kind of what we would see as more arbitrary numbers, but they're looking to expand those buffers and, in essence, remove workable farmland from production, and say we've got to increase those riparian buffers, and that's causing a lot of issues here in Washington. Each year, each legislative session, we keep seeing new legislation, new bills that are coming, or new rules coming out of ecology that are pushing for larger buffers around streams. We also have the agency, the Department of Ecology, that is punishing farms that are spreading water, that they have their water right. They're looking to use it to really decrease or use their water rights in a way that we have a certain amount of water that we can spread, but we're, spreading it over maybe multiple parcels of land. And they're punished because, well, this water was only supposed to be used on this parcel, but now you're spreading it over multiple parcels. And in essence, in their mind, well, we have this set of water that we can use, and ecology is kind of changing the rules a bit, reinterpreting the rules. We're pushing back, saying that you don't have the right to come in and reinterpret the law simply based on what a new administration wants to how it wants to interpret it. And we're seeing over and over that an agency is willing to, if you give them an inch, they'll run that mile until they're held accountable. And that's really something that Safe Family Farming, along with several of the other commodity and association groups that we work in collaboration with, we're really having to step up and start holding these agencies accountable and saying, hey, we've got to push back on some of this, because if you give them an inch, they're going to keep pushing and go that mile, unless we say no, that's you're breaking the law. You don't have that right or authority to do that.
These wider buffers, what is their reasoning behind that? What are they trying to do as they're taking away some of this farmland you're talking about? What's their end game here?
The end game, in many ways, I think historically has been fish habitat, fish passage. That the state, and in many ways, very rightly so. Fish and salmon, in particular, have been historically a huge part of our ecology, and historically as a state, both as a Washington state, but even before that, the tribal relationships, and for the various Native American tribes that are represented here in this state. Fish are really a life source for them and need to be valued and respected. But the difficulty is that we have legislators who are expanding some of those buffers for fish passage, or fish habitat, I should say, fish habitat, and really that these excessively large buffers, scientifically wise, don't necessarily provide a great deal of benefit to fish habitat. Now smaller, 20 to 30, foot buffers, those have value to protecting fish habitat. But when we go into 200, 250 feet of buffer, really it is exponentially has little to no effect. And yet we have these excessively large buffers that are taking away farmland, productive farmland, and saying, this is for fish habitat, and this is we're using it for that cause. When really like I said, the practical side is I don't think this has that level of value that they're claiming or wanting. And in our perspective, really, this is just the state government prioritizing a interest over food and farm production, and saying, we're going to, again, take that, 20 to 30 feet. We're going to run with it as far as and as long as we can until someone holds us accountable. And that really is a process that, but the interesting thing is, and I will say this, one of the things that we're working with a couple other partners is that we want to see a lot of times this issue gets pitted as agriculture versus the tribes,
Sure.
and really that is not, that's a false, I guess, dichotomy. That is a false offensive. That really isn't the reality. That, we've seen over and over when it comes to water. There have been a number of partnerships that really are fantastic down in the Yakima area, some in the peninsula area of the state, that are phenomenal partnerships between agriculture and tribal interests, and they're working together for the common good. And those partnerships have worked, and it's oftentimes, and I don't want to get too sound too fringy, but when you get the state legislature has to then get their fingers in the mix, that's when things kind of start getting a little squirrely. If you can let those local interest groups, the local farmers, those local tribal leaders work together, some good positive partnerships and good results happen that are sustainable, that are viable, that protect each of those interests. And I was actually talking with a tribal leader probably a month or two ago, and he let me know, he's like, we're almost working on the same team. Native Americans, we're farmers too. Fish is our product. That's what we're working on the same page. We have the same priorities. Just like you don't want the land to go away, we don't want the fish to go away. We're working from the same perspective and we're fighting for the same thing. I think there's a lot of ground where we can be on that same page, and yet it's in the interest of some of these agencies or activist groups to kind of pit those two against one another, when in actuality, agriculture and tribal interests could be a lot more in line, and we're seeing some positive partnerships from that. So that's been good.
Early on in this conversation, you mentioned the $400 million loss. So, what is I mean, surely that is getting attention there, right? Like from the politician side of it, how are they addressing that? Is there something they're trying to do on a state level to try to turn this around? I mean, we know what's going on the federal level with the Trump administration with new tariff deals and all that kind of stuff that he's working on. And now they have some new efforts they're talking about maybe to try to lower input costs like fertilizers and stuff. And we've got the whole war to think about with Iran that adds a whole wild card to all this mix. But specifically in Washington, like, I mean, that's a big number. So that has to be attention grabbing, right? So how are they addressing that?
I guess I would like to say yes, they are addressing it, and there are a couple legislators or leaders that have been working on this. In particular, the chair of the House Agriculture Committee has been a strong leader, Representative Christine Reeves. Really appreciate her leadership on this. But unfortunately, it has not seemed to be a priority of the vast majority or the majority within the legislature. We're seeing over and over that things like the higher labor costs, more regulation on certain kind of fine-tuned elements that are affecting agriculture, those are causing problems. We're seeing more and more restrictions on agriculture, the lack of interest to provide for, fuel exemptions and costs that on-farm fuel is supposed to be receiving. These are problems that the legislature just isn't seemingly willing to address. And this last legislature, our legislature meets from about January till March or April, depending on the year. And we saw in this last session really an unfortunate lack of interest to address this. And we put out a kind of an op-ed, I should say, shortly after the legislature convened and or adjourned, and really frustratingly sharing that the legislature was aware that agriculture is losing this much money, that as an industry, as a community, that we are in the red, literally nearly $400 million that farms are being wiped out, that they're going away, they are leaving the state, they're not coming back. And yet the legislature continues to, in essence, turn a blind eye to it, is deaf to this problem. We saw Representative Reeves, the chairwoman of the Agriculture Committee here in the state, who did put forward some legislation that we appreciate, and it was more, we were calling it the Washington State Farm Bill, that really would have provided relief or some subsidization to help incentivize and kind of float agriculture moving forward. And really, it was not the end all be all answer to all our problems, but it was a positive step forward. Unfortunately, that bill didn't receive any sort of serious hearing until really after cutoff. It kind of had more of a symbolic hearing toward the end of session when nothing was actually going to be accomplished. And again, for agriculture, it was another nail in the coffin that our agriculture sees the problem, but they're not willing to do the hard steps to ensure that agriculture has a viable future here in Washington State. And for that farmer who's, seeing that maybe my farm isn't penciling out this year, that is a very, very pessimistic, very deflating thing when you see I am relying on my leaders to provide, to help take care and sustain this. I can't do this when my state leadership is actively working against me, it feels like. And then this past session, really, it was business as usual. And really, agriculture was not priority. We are historically we have been the second largest economic factor in the state, behind aerospace, in Washington State. And yet we are really treated as though we can continue to just chip away and be ignored. And we're seeing that's not going to last. There's going to come a time when Washington State is going to be importing so much more. We take pride in our cherries and apples coming
Hmm.
from Washington State. We have 300 plus commodities that are represented here in Washington State, which really is a unique place in our country that we can see incredible growth and sustain these various commodities. It's something that we value, and we want to see our leaders value that with us. This is something to take pride in, but unfortunately, it seems like our leadership tends to take it for granted that agriculture will always be there. We can chip away at it some more. There's people still going to be farming. I think there's coming to that breaking point where we're saying that this is not sustainable. There could be a future where agriculture in Washington State is no longer a sustainable feature and is going away. And so, Save Family Farming, one of our roles is how do we advocate and really start expressing outrage? How do we start, really starting to share the stories of this is going away? Farming in Washington, it I don't want to be too doom and gloom, but the trajectory we're on, farming is dying. We can turn this around, we can heal, we can improve, but there needs to be some serious action taken by our legislator to turn this ship around, so that we start seeing that downward spiral that agriculture is seeing. We need to start seeing that turn around and move up.
Ben, we appreciate you. Thanks for walking us through this. Thanks for the conversation.
Yes, thank you for giving us a platform to kind of share our perspective and share the work. And if anyone has any questions, please, they can go to our website, www.savefamilyfarming.org. Check us out. We would love to keep that conversation going. And Dave, thank you for the time.
Of course. Perspective this week from Ben Tindall. Now, while his organization is largely focused on the state of Washington, I'm sure you can hear several issues that apply to family farmers in many other states as well. You can check out our profile piece about Ben to learn more about him and his background and Save Family Farming. You'll find that in the American Farmland Owner newsletter. You can find that at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. It's the place where landowners get their news. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.